All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. And excited to have you join for today's webinar discussion, where we'll be sharing some biotech success stories for how biotechs have leveraged digital endpoints in their clinical trials. My name is Sarah Valentine. I lead our partnerships across life sciences here at Dime. And on behalf of the team, we're really happy to have you here. Many of you may not realize it, but around half of the sponsors included in Dime's library of digital endpoints are actually biotech companies. Despite these organizations having maybe access to fewer resources compared to their larger pharmaceutical counterparts, they've been able to champion digital innovation as a means to achieving success in their clinical programs. So in today's discussion, we'll learn how did they do it, how did it go, and what can other biotechs, along with pharma and other leaders in the digital health community, learn from their example. So today, I'm thrilled to be joined by three all-star speakers who will introduce themselves and share their experience and their perspective on where digital endpoints can deliver value in biotech-led clinical trials. Importantly, they'll also share some of the lessons learned so that while we continue to pave new ground with digital endpoints, we're also getting better and better at deployment and deriving value from these new capabilities. So before handing it off to the panelists, I do have a few housekeeping items. Please note that today's session is being recorded. Both the slides and the recording will be available on Dime's webinar page after the session, so you'll be able to share it with any of your colleagues who weren't able to join today. And also please note that we'd love today's discussion to be interactive. We will have more of a live Q&A session where you'll be able to raise your hand in the reactions to ask your questions live. But if you're in a spot where you can't ask your question live, or if you don't want to forget your question, please feel free to type it into the chat box and we'll make sure to cover it when we get to that Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm excited to start things off here, and I'll start with Prashant. Prashant, if you'd be able to come off mute and share a little bit about your experience working with digital endpoints and introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everybody. Very excited to be here. I'm Prashant Bansal. I lead our imaging and digital health technology-based endpoints at Dime Therapeutics. And I'm really excited to be discussing the use of wearable-based endpoints in clinical trials, particularly focusing on unique challenges and opportunities this presents for small biotech companies like Dime Therapeutics. So I think, from a promise perspective, right, I'm preaching to the choir here, right? There is a lot of promise about digital health technologies and eventually digital endpoints for clinical trials. Specifically, wearable technology holds immense promise for capturing continuous, passive, and objective data in clinical trials, which could lead to more sensitive outcome measures, right? It could present itself in terms of detecting subtle changes in patient function, which may lead to smaller sample sizes or shorter trial durations, which are always, great outcomes. It can also improve patient engagement and reach, because now you are able to get to patients who are not able to make it to the clinical visits, especially if the endpoints that you are developing are secondary or primary, and if you're able to evaluate them in a continuous fashion at the patient's home, which will eventually also potentially reduce dropout rates. So that is another clear promise and benefit. And then overarching, right, like from a clinical development program cost perspective, if you are able to implement and develop these endpoints, there might be efficiencies gained over the development program, which could reduce development costs. While this is not a given, if done correctly and if there is success, this could result in reduced costs. Of course, you have to initially invest to ensure that you can reap those benefits down the line. So those are the promises, and I'm sure there are many more, but those are the key ones that I could think of. But of course, it comes with challenges as well, right? How do you translate these promising aspects of digital health technologies into meaningful regulatory endpoints, right? These will present hurdles for specifically from a regulatory perspective, because if you can't push it to a regulatory acceptance, then it really becomes more of an exploratory assessment in your trials, which is useful from a learning perspective. But in small biotechs, as you will hear from other panelists, costs are important to consider, as well as speed and time, right? So I think the regulatory piece is extremely critical, at least from my personal opinion. So how do you get there, right? I think validation and standardization is absolutely critical. This applies across the board for all endpoints, but specifically for novel, technologies, it's very important that we demonstrate that the technology is able to collect accurate data, it's reliable, and the endpoints that you're focusing on are clinically relevant, right? So that is very, very critical. And the data management and analysis aspect is even more critical, specifically for small companies, because these require, ability to consume large data sets. The infrastructure invariably would not exist in small biotech companies. So you're looking for those all-star, I'm going to borrow Sarah's term here, that the all-star vendor partners who can, hold hands together with you to ensure that that piece exists externally, because a lot of times that infrastructure will not probably exist in small biotech companies. And then, as I was saying before, the regulatory acceptance, right? Gaining regulatory buy-in for novel digital endpoints is so important, and it requires a long-winded path of robust evidence generation, clear alignment with clinically meaningful data, which will eventually hopefully result in approval. And we'll go through a case study that can drive that point home. But the time frame, right, is always long for those things. And then, as we all are aware, the patient focus aspect of this is very, very critical as well. We may think that a wearable technology is easy to use. You can just put it on the wrist or on your ankle and kind of, collect data. But getting the patient's voice is so important very early in the clinical development program, so that you can truly focus, one, on what meaningful aspects of health the patients care about. And secondly, do they really like the wearable technology or any other digital health technology that you are planning to use in your studies? So those are the key aspects of hurdles that I felt were important to highlight in order for you to push the endpoints towards a meaningful regulatory endpoint. So in terms of a case study, I think most of you, if not all, have heard about SV95C. It has its stride velocity 95th percentile. It's a wearable sensor-based endpoint that a company called Sysnav has propagated forward in the last several years. And they basically have really done a really fantastic job in terms of ensuring that this is contextual for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy ambulatory participants. So they have collected a lot of the validation data through observational studies, through placebo-controlled trials, and really put together a package that has demonstrated not only that it is relevant for the patient population, but also correlates with clinically relevant endpoints in DMD. And by doing all of that work, which took several years, they have been able to gain regulatory acceptance, at least in the EMA, through their CHMP qualification process, first as a secondary endpoint for DMD ambulatory patients, and then as a primary endpoint for DMD participants. So this, to me, I feel is a very nice use case that reflects the kind and the amount of work that one would need to do in order for an endpoint to become accepted by regulatory bodies. Again, this is only in the EMA. So even if it is not globally accepted, at least in some regulatory bodies, it may be accepted. While it is an excellent success story, it also is kind of gives you some thinking points around the effort that is needed, right? And it still is focused on DMD, right? So where we would really need to go, I feel, again, this is my personal opinion, I feel like we need to think about broad therapeutic areas, right? Broad meaningful aspects of health that can be used interchangeably across indications. So currently we have an example of SV95C, we have MVPA, which Peter will cover, but these endpoints need to be propagated across indications. That way, small biotechs that are short on resources could then leverage almost like a toolbox where you could say, oh, for if you are interested in lower mobility, these are the 3 endpoints that have been validated for different indications, but they are relevant for my indication as well. I could do a small amount of work to validate it for my indication and then use it in my clinical trials. And because I feel like almost everything that we do in clinical development requires a village. So the way to overcome these obstacles, I feel collaboration is key. And I feel like, organizations like Dime are so critical for that. So if through a consortia in a pre-competitive space, if we can join forces with stakeholders to pool data, to share best practices, to develop standardized approaches, there is nothing like it. Running observational studies in a pre-competitive space to kind of develop endpoints that are cross therapeutic areas would be amazing. You need excellent vendor partnerships, like I was mentioning before. And then finally, engaging with regulators and patients as per your requirements for your clinical development program is also very, very critical. So just to kind of cap that off, right, I feel like this has a lot of promise, but I hope that I have not created a dampener here. But I do also feel like there is a lot of work that needs to go in for these endpoints to become real, which means that regulatory bodies are ready to accept them. And the amount of work that is needed for that almost is never going to go away. So the more we think about how we can build efficiencies and effective partnerships to get to that point where we can have endpoints that can serve multiple therapeutic areas would be the ideal scenario to be in to keep moving this field forward. But it's exciting times, and I'm very excited. So I would like to thank Sarah for giving me the opportunity to speak here, and I think we'll take questions after all the panelists have spoken. So I'll go on mute now, Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Prashant. I think you really set the stage quite well as to, where's the value for biotech organizations and what do they need in order to de-risk actually achieving that value. So next up, we will have Lauren Alani from SUSE. So Lauren, if you'd like to come off mute and share a little bit, introduce yourself and share a bit about your experience.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I am the Director of Digital Innovation at a company called Zeus Plus. I specialise in helping biotechs to safeguard their data integrity and to also gain better control of the computerized systems used to operationalise their clinical trial. So essentially helping them to achieve regulatory compliance, but also helping to build their confidence in the data coming out of the clinical trial at the end of the day. I also support their data and digital strategy, which improves the likelihoods of success of their clinical trial to ensure that it follows the 3 E's is what I call it of digital innovation, which is to ensure it's engaging, that it's efficient, and also that they're gaining the data they need to make effective decision-making throughout the process. So typically the services I would tend to cover are things like a clinical systems analysis. That's where we determine the electronic data flow, the risks and opportunities to data integrity, as well. And I also do the digital landscape assessment. That's where we look at innovative technologies and how they can add value to clinical trials. And that's really how digital measures come into the picture. For context of some of the experience I'll be sharing today, the type of biotechs that I tend to work with are ones that have between 1 and 4 assets, and approximately 1 of those are in clinical development, and that might be phase 2 or 3, for example. What I tend to find about the biotechs I work with, at least, is that they are very, they've got a bigger risk, degree of risk that they're willing to take. And that's because they're very much driven by a finite budget based on their funding amount. So they have only so much money and then it's all gone. So every little counts. And so they do have to look at innovative ways to get the level of data that they need to make good decisions. And also that they are under immense pressure to meet their timelines. So that makes them very, very nimble, very agile. They want to innovate, and they generally do look at digital endpoints and measurements as good opportunities for them. So quite a few of my biotechs have been looking and using digital measures, some of them very successfully, and actually taking advantage of some of those amazing benefits that Prashant very kindly kind of walked us through at the beginning. And then others, I have to say, less successfully so. And there've definitely been lessons learned. And I'm really happy to be on the panel discussion today so I can actually share some of those experiences and hopefully help with your clinical trials and what you're really thinking about in the future. I also, I mentioned that I work for Zeus Plus. So for those of you who don't know who we are, we're a vendor relationship optimization consultant with a strong focus in data integrity. We really look at the strategy and execution of clinical trials and ensuring that we're getting the best out of our CRO and vendor relationships and helping to achieve the quality and volume of data out to the clinical trial. So that's a bit about me and my experience. And yeah, really excited to share some of this learning with you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. And then finally, we have Peter. Peter, I know you had shared a few slides, so if you'd like to introduce yourself and then walk us through a little bit of your journey with digital endpoints.
Yeah, as you see, my name is Peter Fernandez, and I like the word former, and I'll give you a reason why. I was the chief executive officer of Bellerophon, which is now no more, and also the chief regulatory safety and quality officer. So you see, small biotechs, you have to wear many hats. What I'm going to do is give you what we actually did, take the plunge with a digital endpoint. And Prashant, really, I liked your overview on the journey that you're telling everyone they would need to go through. And Lauren, I like when you said it's always budget, it's time, and and Prashant, you stressed on the FDA. I'll go very quickly to these three key areas that we actually took the plunge in and show you where it is. So I'll talk to you about the cost and time savings we actually experienced with a digital endpoint, applying a digital endpoint. And then, although the study drug failed to show effect, I will show you the outcome of just the actography alone as a patient natural study on how we've seen that the actography endpoint actually works using anchoring. Okay, next slide, please. So what we did was, as Prashant said, you need solid data and you need FDA buy-in. Without the FDA buy-in, it's like, a wild goose chase. You need to convince the FDA that you're hitting at the right target. We did a phase 2 study, and as you will see, we were able to show a 21 change in MVPA compared to placebo, which FDA agreed was clinically meaningful in this population. So next slide, please. So this is the core data that we had for the FDA. And of course, it looks so simple. We ask FDA a simple question. Is FDA in agreement that our phase 3 study with physical activity as measured by actography as the primary endpoint? And see, I love it when we say, yes, we agree with your study design. But getting this one sentence, Prashant, was not without effort. It was over 9 to 10 back and forth to the point that to one point, we almost gave up. And I actually called Norm Stockbridge from the division and I said, I can take no more. Our company is reaching the end. Either I get your yes, and that's when I got, yes, we agree with your study design. We then went on. So that is it. Getting the FDA yes is very important. And I'll tell you why. Because as small biotech, we are funded. We are not a Novartis or a Merck with billions of dollars. Everything that we do has to be funded by investors, and they look at what's your regulatory feedback. And if the FDA gives you a tough time, you're not going to get funding. But with this, we were able to get funding to initiate the study. Next slide, please. Now, what happened was, as we were doing the study, COVID hit us and we were not recruiting. So we reanalyzed the data. By then, we had agreed with FDA on what a compliant day really is. In the beginning, we were going all out, using every day as a time point. FDA then agreed on a very unique criteria for what was a client day. This also you need to discuss with the FDA is what will they accept as an acceptable cut point. And here we got agreement that 8 days out of 2 weeks with 2 weekends with 600 minutes was a compliant day. When we ran that analysis, we found we did not need 300 patients that we were budgeting for. We actually only needed, if you see in blue, 80 patients to get a 0.05. Be conservative. For 0.01, we needed 114. We went with 140. Once again, we just did not go to the 140. I went back to the FDA, got them in writing to agree that if we met our endpoint with 140, we'd get the approval. Once again, going back to the FDA with solid data. Next slide. So now what happened, going down to the 140, when I first went to investors, because I was also covering finance, I needed, with the COVID, I needed another 30 million more with a delay in the study of a year if I stayed with 300. No investor was willing to put any money. When I went back to them and I said, hey, I don't need any more of your money. With what I have, I can get to 140. I was able to proceed with my study and actually increase investor interest, because now they said, if you don't need money, now we want to give you money. It's always the case. When I don't need something, I get bountiful amounts of cash. When I need, nobody wants to give it to you. So anyway, we finished the study with the 140 patients. The endpoint didn't work, but let's go to the last slide. However, when we looked, these patients are worsening, and this is a very, very critical slide. Actually, FDA said for the first time they're seeing something as picturesque as this, and picturesque why. You see, if you extrapolate the 50% of the patients, they have gone down in count by about 400 counts. Those that did not change, the green, are almost above the zero, and those that are much better are 100. So this is what FDA wants in the anchoring. You need to anchor your endpoint to a patient-reported outcomes, which was PGIS, and we were able to show. So the endpoint works. That is the most important. So the last slide. And the last slide is a take-home message. The study failed, but innovation has always started that a first iteration, you try doing something for the first time, jumping a hurdle, you may not make it, but then you perfect it and you perfect it, and hopefully by the third attempt, it will work. So it has given us an opportunity to learn and iterate, and we have not just given up. I'm working with Dime, I'm working with VivaSense, I'm working with Cytel to see what it is that we can strengthen. And I'm hoping that someone gives me a drug that I can once again apply actigraphy and show that it actually works to get a drug approved. That's all. But try to squeeze 5 years in 5 minutes.
You did an excellent job of it too. Thank you, Peter. So with that, we are going to go into our Q&A portion. So again, if you do have questions, I'd encourage you to put those in the chat. In the meantime, I do have a question for all of you, but Lauren, maybe we'll start with you. You work with several different biotechs across the field. I guess when you think about some of the challenges that you're often seeing biotechs running into, what really comes to mind, and what surprised you the most about the different challenges that these biotechs are facing as opposed to kind of pharmaceutical counterparts?
So for the challenges, we faced quite a few, but I think there's there's three that I think that are really important to raise that I've seen multiple biotechs kind of stumble over. So the first one that I think is important to raise is, and it's again to echo something that Prashant said earlier, which is around validation. So validation is an incredibly important checkpoint to make sure that the data that you're collecting is actually validated for your therapeutic area and patient population. And I've actually seen quite a few biotechs, unfortunately, not know that this is something that they need to check and that is a responsibility of them. And they've actually initiated these studies at collecting this data without prior checking that the validation is in place. And I think that's really because unless you have specific team members as a part of your organization who have had experience of implementing digital measures within a clinical trial space, particularly within the last couple of years, because that's where we've seen huge changes in the regulatory guidance. I mean, it's still obviously in the direction that we're seeing regulatory guidance go in, but giving a lot more clarity over what their expectations are, and what the level of responsibility the sponsor has. And if they haven't implemented that in the last couple of years, then the lack of knowledge, not knowing whether to check this, is creating a bit of an issue. And quite frankly, if you don't have the validation in place, then you lack data integrity, which according to EMEA means that you're equal to data loss and data destruction. So not an ideal situation to be in. Now, we have actually worked with some biotechs who have realized they're in this situation. And if you are in this situation, there is a solution, or there's an option to take, which is retrospective validation as well. But obviously this isn't ideal because it doesn't guarantee success, but it does mean that you have something that you can potentially look at to protect your data. There is obviously a cost to it and a timeline, so that all needs thorough consideration, but at least there is something there that you can consider to do. But quite honestly, it's obviously better to have this knowledge up front and to check it ahead of time. The second challenge is really around transparency. So I see that some biotechs on working with their CROs and vendors don't have the level of access they need to their systems or documents. And that lack of transparency means that it's very hard for them to provide oversight, and therefore they're not in control of the data and they're at high risk of their data integrity. So, for example, we saw a warning letter last year from FDA to Applied Therapeutics, where actually one of their vendors had deleted patient data. So that creates obviously that lack of transparency. They didn't know. It creates that risk. I've also seen it and had the experience of data inaccuracy as well. So I had a biotech who didn't have access to their eCOA platform, and therefore there was months delay for them to actually receive that data back. And by the time they actually received it, they realized the data that was being collected was actually outside of the parameters of what was normal for that therapeutic area and an indication. So the data was being collected wrongly. So obviously they lost months worth of data. And really, I think for this challenge, there's actually an opportunity here for biotechs to get ahead and have great conversations with their vendors before the start of the study to agree on what systems they're going to get access to and the frequency, and also to which documents they're going to receive as well. And then the third and final one that I'd summarize would be for selection. So I often see technology being used because it's word of mouth or the cool thing that we've seen at a conference, and actually not taking the time to properly analyze both the value that this digital measure has to offer their clinical trial, but also the likelihood of acceptance for regulators as well. And I really liked Prashant's example of the DMD digital endpoint. So for using that as an example, if you know that the data has been accepted as a primary endpoint, then you can have confidence in using it in your clinical trial. So yeah, they're the three that I would certainly conclude.
Yeah. I think it's great that we're hearing from, I think, all three speakers at different points that, you know, it is critically important to do your homework and make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. There's less room for failure for biotechs is what I'm hearing. Peter, Prashant, I'm not sure if you would have anything else to add in terms of challenges or things that surprised you as you were putting digital endpoints into your clinical trials. And Prashant, you're on mute, just as a heads up.
Sorry, I was on mute. I think not necessarily a surprise, but I feel like, two aspects, right, which I think I might have covered in my earlier conversation as well, is the patient voice is extremely critical. It's becoming more and more front and center as we think about endpoints. And then the second is the clinical meaningfulness, right? Like we can't assume just because it's digital, just because it's passive, just because it's continuous, it's always going to be better. So I think really focusing on that aspect early on and ensuring that you are at least putting things in place where you could evaluate that, especially if there is nothing out there that you can repurpose. And if you are developing the endpoint from scratch in your clinical development program from the early phase studies, I feel like it's very critical, similar to what Peter showed in his beautiful graph of the PGIS versus the MVP accounts. I feel like those kinds of activities are very critical. So whether you're anchoring it to a PRO or you're using a hard continuous clinical endpoint, but just generating MCID data is so critical. And a lot of times people might not focus on that, assuming most times incorrectly that just because it's digital, just because it's continuous, it's good. At least that's, I think, one learning for me, which is very critical as you think about these, because they are not, one size fits all.
Starting with the patient. I like that. Now, Peter, one of the things that you mentioned kind of in your discussion, obviously, you were wearing several different hats within Bellerophon. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts. When you're thinking about the capabilities that are needed to deploy a digital measure like MVPA in your study, what aspects of that implementation do you think that biotech should consider outsourcing? Like, what did you outsource versus what did you do in-house? Is it possible, like if you don't have a fully staffed digital health team, to actually implement these digital endpoints? Curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, you've touched on a little sore point because I'll tell you why in a good way. Um, I've been in this business for 40 years, so regulatory is my 101. I've dealt with the FDA, quality and safety. So doing that part and running a team. The biggest gap that I had is, as Lauren says, is data scientists. We did not have data scientists. I had one engineer who was actually an electrical engineer who was doing my data science. And then I was working with actography. They are device developers, but I did not have core data scientists. So the mistake, of course, in the end, the drug didn't work, but what you said, doing the homework, the validation part, where you see the content validity, where you are able to actually check with the patients as to what is meaningful, because FDA comes back with what's meaningful. We did the meaningful part, but we did not look at different cut points. I shared with you MVPA, but Sarah, you're aware I'm working with another. Now I'm working with data scientists, real data scientists, to be able to see what other cut points really made a meaning. When I looked at overall outcomes instead of MVPA, I get a much better curve. That means besides MVPA, maybe the light was doing much better. These are patients. What I used was an experience of healthy patients. That's why who does vigorous? I don't remember when was the last time I did anything vigorous. Forget about a patient with PAH. So exactly the thing that small biotech does not have are these data scientists and the people who help you with the validation. We read the guidances, but you don't read the fine point and you don't have the experience. Regulatory is easy. FDA will hammer you until they get what they need. So you know what's wrong. But if you don't have the right data scientists, you do not validate, do the right things right up front, you're not going to get the best endpoint. So had the drug worked, we would have shown an effect, but we would have got a much better effect if probably I had moved away from MVA and actually gone with just a movement. That means I've shifted the activity per patient, and most of the activity might have been in light. But now I'm realizing that, and after the fact, of course, I may not have had the time to do it, but I should. That is the question you have: is go out with your science. Now, if you don't have regulatory, also get a good regulatory person, because you don't want to mess with FDA. You mess with FDA, you're in a black hole again. But these are two things: your data scientist and your homework and getting the right stuff to the FDA, because you cannot fool them. They have the right data scientists too.
Absolutely. Good advice. Anything, Lauren, Prashant, that you would add beyond regulatory data science, obviously doing your homework?
Yeah,
I
I
think
think I'd just say it was to reiterate, I think yes, regulatory is important, and to know that, as I kind of said earlier, there's been huge changes in the last couple of years. So it's all of those big changes that have happened. So and that's why it's really hard to kind of keep up with that. And it obviously takes time for biotechs to accrue that knowledge in order to keep ahead. So what they tend to lack is that specific system knowledge, which increases the risk to their data integrity. So for example, Big Pharma's been doing electronic data flow diagrams for a long time and getting the benefit and the value out of it. But it's only recently come up in the regulatory guidance that this is now required, for in a protocol related document, you have to do it. But this isn't something that they necessarily know that is required. So in order to keep compliant, they need to do it, but there's also the value point of doing it. So if they're actually using digital measures, there's huge value to doing it because this data isn't necessarily going into EDC. So where is it going? And does it need to be aggregated with other data for your data scientists? And what is the source data as well? So, because obviously you need that for a proper retention and archival purposes. And then another thing I tend to notice is that there's a lot of startup companies in this space. So they don't necessarily have the same robustness as the bigger vendors that you expect that you're working with. And I also see that biotechs are working with them more directly than necessarily like through their CROs, which means that they need to consider their oversight as well of how they're going to manage it. So really coming back to the question, what do they need to get in-house? Well, they need that knowledge of safeguarding their data integrity and knowing which computerized systems are being used and the flow of data throughout their clinical trial. And if they don't have it, then they need to outsource it. They need to get it in through external partners.
Awesome. Prashant, it looked like you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think both Peter and Lauren covered a lot of ground there. I feel like one point that probably is worth mentioning just on the like tying these things together, right? Eventually, you need to follow all the clinical development or drug development 101 approaches, right? Data integrity, audit trail, controls, and one of the things that is important to highlight also is that working with vendors that have the expertise and experience can help you significantly, especially if you are a small biotech, because you may not have the knowledge base within your company early on as you are starting to do these things for various reasons. But as you, if you partner with the right vendors, then they can be a thought partner with you as well to help you get through those hurdles as well. So I think it's critical. And then the other aspect is the raw data access, right? Like all of these, established wearables vendors will allow you access to the raw data that is being collected. So you're not really mining everything. I think I love the point that Peter made, right? If you have data science, data engineering in functions in your company, then you can actually do a lot more with the raw data because there is so much value there that you're not extracting. But the raw data, one, it being stored appropriately and then you having access eventually is also critical because you can always go back, right, to learn more like Peter is doing now. And that's really powerful as well.
Absolutely. And Peter, actually, there is a question here in the chat from Nick Nikolovsky, kind of thanking you for your comment around the importance of data science. He was curious around kind of the, why data science was not something that you considered at the start of the study, if it was cost related, if it was, you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. Curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And as they say, in hindsight is always 2020. I realized my mistake, but at that time I was on a budget crunch. We had a fixed budget. I had to finish the study on time, and I relied on the device developers who are not totally data science. They gave me what they believed was the right endpoint. So I went with my gut feeling, not being a data scientist. I went with my gut feeling thinking, hey, I'm sticking with NVPA. And actually at one of the meetings, one of the data scientists actually challenged me and asked me and said, Peter, you have 60 minutes of MVPA in patients with um, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Do you even believe they do more than 7 to 10 minutes? And I knew that they had hit on the right thing. I had chosen the wrong cut point. And I said, you're asking me a question that's confidential. I'll talk to you. And I didn't want to admit openly. I knew that I was going down the wrong path. But again, if I had to redirect my path and go back to data scientists, I would have finished my resources. I said, let me go down, keep MVPA, and then I'll think after that. Once you're down the chute, you just go ahead. Yeah, so I did not do it, one, because of lack of knowledge. That was not my area of expertise. I went with what my gut feeling was, and then it was budget issues. But
Appreciate
don't
that.
let those things try to hold you back. It's if you don't have a good foundation, your building is going to fall.
I think these are important learnings for other biotechs, especially as they're starting to take the plunge into this space, to use your words. So appreciate that.
And one more point I know was not in the agenda, but it's always my burning desire to disclose, but I don't want to downplay on the validation, the big validation issue. When I went down the path of wanting to use actography as a primary endpoint, I did bring people, ex-FDA people, who talked to me about validation. When I saw the validation effort, I got scared.
Mm.
So I went down a different route, which I don't think anyone has taken that attempt. That's why I call it the plunge. Instead of doing the full content validation, the FDA guidances where you do everything in a phase 2, I went with what was known as an acceptance. I went directly to the division that I was doing my clinical study, to the division director, to those people. Now, to some extent, they were not data scientists. Again, they looked at it from the clinical point of view, and they agreed that your endpoint has meaning. It's the voice of the patient. They didn't go down into the nitty-gritty of doing all the whole content validity and the whole gamut. So I did not go the qualification route. And that's what big pharma is doing. Why they have not got endpoints in phase 3, they are not going ahead until they have completed the big qualification part. And I'm telling you, I know people who have tried that route, and it's almost like, the tunnel is endless. I went down the simple route. It took 3 to 4 years, but directly to the FDA division that had my drug, and I call it the acceptance route, not the qualification. So there's a big difference in the effort that you have. Of course, once I got it, others could have tried it, but it's not, to be broad, you need to do the qualification. I don't know if you want to comment on your experience with the qualification versus the acceptance route.
I think certainly what we've seen is that qualification, to your point, takes quite a bit of time, right? It's very costly. It's probably not something that's feasible for a biotech.
Yeah.
Acceptance is a lot more feasible. It does require you to, again, do your homework, have the validation, have kind of evidence that indicates that the measure is acceptable within the context of use, right? And Peter, I think the example that you shared was a really great example of, what does good acceptance look like? So I think that's appreciated. Looks like Doug also added a comment here. If you go down that route of has meaning or accepted, you are not proving that the data is right or wrong. Validation is designed to prove that. Yeah. I think yeah, part of whether FDA accepts something is whether or not it is, the validation is acceptable within that particular study. So
So what we did was we agreed with the FDA that we would do the validation, which is the anchoring, only specific to that disease and that population in parallel with phase 3, rather than doing a whole separate validation program, getting the minimum clinically importance difference, defining the questions, defining the endpoint, and then going into phase 3. That's why I always call it taking the plunge. Before you know how to swim, you jump in the deep end.
Absolutely. Prashant, I'm actually going to come to you next. I'm curious, within a biotech organization, when we think about the differences between a biotech and a pharma, right? Like biotechs have fewer programs that are running at once versus, a whole plethora of programs across therapeutic areas. So I'm curious, when you think about the capabilities, or I guess when you think about the different programs that are ongoing simultaneously, are there specific considerations to designing your digital measurement strategy that might differ from a larger organization that has more programs running?
It's a good question. I don't think there is a simple answer to that. But I feel like, the way I think about it is because we are a small organization, we don't really think about it as a platform. It's really driven by the clinical program and the question that we are trying to answer. So, what is it that you're trying to measure? Is it something that is going to result in additional data, which is exploratory in nature early on, and eventually might bubble up as a higher endpoint? To Peter's point, right? Like, will we go through the acceptance route? Or because I think I think it has been discussed already, probably going through the validation route is a very long process unless your external partners or vendors have already done it, like Sysnav did. It's that path becomes very, very difficult. So I feel like it's driven by the clinical programs. I think, and I haven't done this in the big pharma, so I don't know, but I would imagine that in a big pharma, you would think more from a platform approach perspective because you have so many programs. So can I use one system, one vendor, and kind of, use it across programs would be the thought. And if it needs all of that early work to establish it as a platform, then a big pharma has the muscle to do it, whereas a biotech might not. So I think, at least in my mind, as I think about implementing digital technologies in our programs, it's really around the clinical question that we're trying to answer. Which vendor is the most mature that can get me to that answer the quickest? And we make decisions based on that rather than thinking, how can I be more efficient across and can I take, I mean, eventually I think that will happen, but because of the time requirement and the questions being specific, we really can't think about platforms, at least early on.
Mhm. That makes sense. Lauren, I'm curious if that's consistent with what you're seeing with all of the different groups that you're working with.
Yeah, I think so. I think if I had to summarize it, I would say that there are three key things to think about when they're doing their digital measurement strategy, and that would be one, how's it going to impact your timelines? Two, how's it going to impact your data quality or volume? And then three, how is it going to add value to your organization or asset? And kind of looking at it in those lights. And I would say the only other thing I'd really add is to ensure that you start early, because the earlier you start with your digital measurement strategy, the better you can consider those opportunities and also evaluate the solutions. So I liked Prashant's mention of going for the bigger, more robust organizations. That's not always necessary, not always possible, but you just certainly want to look for the solutions that are the furthest along, the most able to address your needs and requirements. And I also think there's an opportunity here for biotechs to work more closely with these vendors as well, because the vendor, what they essentially want to get is validation out of their using their data, obviously depending on the market opportunity that there is. So if it's a rare disease, it'll be less attractive. Bigger therapeutic areas, more attractive, more likely to work with you. Whereas what the biotech wants is obviously more data. So it might not start as primary or secondary, which is obviously the end goal, because the better and the bigger positioning you can have for that digital measure, the more helpful that will be in the long run. But essentially, any of this kind of data can add value to your asset and to the company, because what it shows is it can provide that continuous data points that give you more data, but also show the actual impact that it's having on the population of interest, which can be very attractive for your acquisition model for big pharma, for that kind of route that you might be going down.
Appreciate that. Those are helpful insights, and the tale as old as time. Get started as soon as possible, or as early on as possible. I almost wonder if that's like an opportunity that biotechs in particular have compared to pharma colleagues. If it's easier to start sooner, thinking about these digital measure strategies or digital endpoints, and starting to plant those seeds sooner. So curious.
Yeah, I'd step in here and say definitely it's easier to start sooner because you don't have the number of layers of hierarchy, boards, and management that you have to get approval for. And often the effort that it takes in big pharma to, I worked at Novartis and Boehringer and Altana, and these were big pharma. No matter what you take, it has to go to 3 to 4 layers, and it always comes back to you. Did you address this question? Did you address this question? Now, there may be reasons why they're pushing you back. Sometimes it's because of budget reasons, but you don't know. In a small biotech, when you why you are being pushed back. If you've not done the homework, or if there are budget constraints, you know exactly what are the roadblocks and you know how to overcome them. And decision making is literally overnight. You bring the issue up, you address it, and next morning you're acting on it immediately, which is not the case. And I'm not criticizing or not saying anything about big pharma. There's a big process. That's why they're making 50, 60 billion, while we sometimes disappear into the sun.
I would
Absolutely.
agree with that. I think the decision making definitely is faster, and I feel like if the senior management is on board with your overarching digital strategy, then it really becomes a question on, like I was saying before, right, on the clinical program, what is the question that you're trying to answer and what the solution is. So I feel like from that perspective, the communication pathways are much simpler, and that
Mm.
helps in terms of moving the decision making forward faster.
Well, these are helpful insights. I appreciate kind of the conversation, and I know that we are kind of nearing the end of our session today. So I'm curious if you could all kind of leave us a few nuggets of wisdom here. Where do you see the future of digital endpoints in biotech? Do you think that things will grow? We've talked about some of the benefits, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. Where do you see things headed? And maybe we'll start with Prashant.
Um, Ooh, this is fun. I think I do feel like I'm optimistic, right? I feel like there has been some real gains in the past few years in terms of regulatory acceptance. I think eventually it comes down to that. The more success stories we have, like it would have been really, really awesome if Peter's drug would have worked. Then we would have had a combination, right? So we are clearly seeing that there is more willingness from the regulatory agencies to consider these endpoints, which is fantastic. Now we need a few drugs to work, which I think will eventually lead to more investments, and then people will coalesce around it. So I do feel like I think there are definitely positive signs in terms of how the future might look like. And in order for, like, just as a community, I think we like we discussed today, right? Like if we take the right steps and be not necessarily cautious, but be measured in terms of how we implement and extract this data, then I think we'll set ourselves up for those eventual successes as well. So I feel like success begets success. So I think we need a few hits, both on the drug aspect and the endpoint aspect. But I do feel like the future looks bright, and as these things improve and get better, I think we are going to be in a position where there might be digital endpoints almost de facto in most protocols.
Thank you, Prashant. Lauren, do you agree, disagree? Any hot takes?
I do. I'm equally optimistic. I think that there is a lot of tech development continuing, and it's really exciting to see. We obviously started off with biometrics as a watch, and now we've got it on a ring. Now we've got scratch on a ring as well. So, all this technology is developing. We're also seeing the general population increase the amount of tech that we have in our homes, that in our everyday use, whether it be an Apple Watch, whether it be a video doorbell. So people are more accustomed to this type of technology, which means that there is an increase in the higher potential for having and utilizing novel endpoints in the future. And we know that biotechs will always continue to innovate, because that's what makes them magical and fantastic organizations to work with, and because they need to meet the demands of time frame that they're on and the cost. And then you've got organizations like Dime, which are obviously really helping to push this information and knowledge and really make it accessible to the community, which means that we are able to share these stories, that we are able to learn from each other. So all of that I think is very encouraging, and I think we'll continue to see biotechs taking advantage of these novel and rich data sources.
Thank you, Lauren. And Peter, to round us out, any thoughts on the future of digital
Very
endpoints?
quick. Yeah, very quick. Time and money drive innovation. And those who have not come on the bandwagon earlier, that was 5 to 7, I believe today all big pharma is now on the bandwagon, and they know it's time and money. So it's like, any innovation, slow start and then take off like crazy. And I see next 2 to 3 years really an upward movement, because again, it's time and cost.
Absolutely. Comes down to that. Well, appreciate you all joining us today, and appreciate everyone making the time in their day to engage in today's webinar. Again, these slides and recordings will be posted, but before we take off, I do have a couple of calls to action for you all. First off, thank you to our panelists, Lauren, Prashant, and Peter. Appreciate you sharing your wisdom. If you are interested in taking the plunge, and in particular calling out something that Prashant said earlier today, thinking about how we can leverage digital measures and digital endpoints across a variety of indications, then this project might be right for you. If you're working in the pediatric rare disease space, would encourage you to check it out. Consider joining us. And if you're just getting started with digital measures and digital endpoint capabilities, we do also have some work coming up around scaling digital health within pharma and biotech organizations. So definitely feel free to scan the code and share your interest in joining us for that. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, your morning, your afternoon, your evening, wherever you are, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.